So, on that note, ask me questions. Questions, comments, questions?
Yeah, you said in Istanbul that they have a law where if you establish your home overnight and are living in it by morning, there are certain regulations or standards that you have to have as far as what the house is, what the home is. Can you just like pitch a tent and then?
Well, it has to be what they consider minimally habitable.
Okay.
So what most people do is they're very efficient. They use quick drying concrete, stuff that'll set in maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, and they go in there, they frame it out, they pour it, and they move in. It may still be drying, but courts have ruled that that's considered habitable. So it wouldn't be just a tent. Other questions? Yeah.
Just about Istanbul, these would probably be the same houses that collapsed during the earthquake.
No, it's an interesting thing. The government attempted to blame the squatters for much of the damage during the earthquakes. But what actually happened was with an understanding that they could get away with overnight kind of construction, private developers started using that technique. And they would build buildings without building permits. Most of the squatter buildings are like 3 stories tall, maybe 4 or 5. But private developers were building buildings 10, 12, 15 stories tall with not enough reinforcement in them to withstand the earthquakes. Those were the buildings that pancaked during the earthquakes, and that was where the most of the carnage was. It's interesting, I was in a squatter community. There was an article in the papers here about a squatter community named Küçükgarmatlı, which the article asserted was very destroyed during the earthquake in 1999. And I went there with a friend who lived there, and I asked him what happened during the earthquake. He said, well, nothing. We heard rumble. Some exterior plaster came off our building. Maybe there was a crack here and there, but nothing happened. I don't know how these stories get circulated. I walked all through the community. All the buildings were intact. There wasn't anything knocked down. They were all tiny 1- and 2-story buildings, and none of them were new. So I don't know how these stories get perpetuated in the media, but governments have a tendency to blame the squatters for any ills that occur. Questions, comments, anything else? Yeah?
From your experience, who would you say actually, in the majority of the places, owns the land that the squatters have seized anywhere?
Okay, mostly it's government. They're pretty smart about that. Portions of Hosinya were not. Portions of Hosinya were privately owned. But the squatters, again, were fairly savvy. It was a real estate development that had gone bust many years ago, and so there was a lot of contention over who actually owned it. And so there wasn't really one legal owner to come and try to evict people. But most often they try to find government-owned land. Yeah?
Do they ever stop being, considered squatters?
It does happen. There are, in Turkey, quite a number of squatter communities. There's one that started as 100% squatter called Umraniye, which has now basically mapped itself, cut itself up into private parcels, and awarded title deeds to quite a number of people. And there are other communities that have banded together when they've had the opportunity to buy their communities as sort of cooperatives or societies. But in order to do that, you have to have a source of income. You have to be able to get the money for it. I talked with some squatters in Turkey who had purchased their title deeds from the government, and they had gone into hock to do so. So they had gotten money from relatives and some money from the city. Now, the city is trying to get them to pay up, and they don't have enough money to pay. And their relatives are trying to get them to pay up and they don't have enough money to pay. So ironically, they may be forced to sell and become a squatter again somewhere else in order to pay back the debt that they ran into. It would have been better for them to actually remain as squatters and not take the opportunity to buy their title deed. So, but in some cases it's worked out, but not the majority. Yeah?
Has anything been done in Brazil concerning the legality of these favelas?
Well, there's some attempts to legalize the land in some communities, and also in some cities, not in Rio, but in Porto Alegre and Belo Horizonte. They've essentially written zoning codes to match what is in the squatter communities. So they've tried to make zoning reflect the community so as to make the community at least quasi-legal according to the building or zoning code. But they haven't worked out the issues of titles at all. You know, the history of title in the rest of the world is very vague. I mean, in Brazil early on, all title was a gift of the emperor. And so there's a huge amount of the country that was never actually parceled out or cut into private parcels. And then there's a whole cottage industry of people who fake title deeds. You know, they basically fabricate title deeds, or they find a title deed that has someone's name in it, and they change the location on it so as to reflect that it's another place. I mean, this goes on all the time. So there isn't a real tradition. I tried to find out. I wanted to do the normal American title search on who owned Rocinha. And I went all over the place to ask people, where would I go to do this? And they said, there is no place to go and do this. It's not like we have a title registry, something that we take for granted. In New York, you know, there's a city register. You go down, you look it up, you can see who owns it, who mortgaged it, everything's right there. It doesn't exist in Brazil. So it's awful hard to do. Yeah?
I was going to ask, is one of the problems that it would be a burden on the government to pay for, like, city services like water, sewage, electric? I mean, is that one reason why they don't legalize them?
They're certainly, they claim that. But Turkey has managed to spend quite a bit of money running water to many of the squatter communities. They put a lot of money into it, capital budget money, through the Water Authority. And there's a